A quiet call that changed everything. The late afternoon sun stretched golden streaks across the asphalt outside Maggie's pit stop, a roadside diner just off Highway 26 in Cheyenne, Wyoming. It was the kind of place where the coffee never stopped flowing, where ranchers, truckers, and locals swapped stories over greasy burgers and thick milkshakes. Inside, the low murmur of conversation and the occasional clatter of silverware created a familiar, comfortable rhythm. But outside, something was about to break the routine. A man in his mid-40s rolled into the parking lot, his sleek, matte black wheelchair moving smoothly over the pavement. His name was Dawson Reed. Dressed in a fitted flannel and well-worn jeans, he had the kind of quiet presence that didn't demand attention but somehow still got it. Dawson had stopped by for a late lunch after a long morning of errands. He wasn't in a rush. He had no reason to suspect that in just a few minutes, he'd become the target of trouble. Trouble that didn't know what it was about to walk into. Across the lot, a group of 5 bikers lounged near their motorcycles, their leather jackets catching the last streaks of Wyoming sunlight. Their conversation was loud, their laughter sharper than it needed to be. One of them, a stocky guy with a blonde buzz cut, nudged his buddy and jerked his chin toward Dawson. "Check it out," he muttered, rolling in style. The others followed his gaze, and within seconds, a sneer spread across the leader's face. His name was Grady Knox, and if there was one thing he loved more than his bike, it was making sure everyone around him knew exactly who was in charge. "Hey, speed racer," Grady called out, his voice carrying across the lot. The group chuckled, low and mean. Dawson didn't acknowledge them. He kept rolling forward, his focus locked on the diner door. His pace was steady, his posture relaxed. He'd been in situations like this before. He knew how it played out. But Grady and his crew weren't the type to let things slide. One of the bikers peeled away from the group, stepping into Dawson's path. He was tall, lanky, with a twisted smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. Jace, the youngest of the bunch, had the restless energy of someone always looking for trouble. "Where's the fire, buddy?" Jace jeered. "Or are you just out for a joyride?" Another round of laughter. Dawson slowed slightly, his fingers tightening against the wheel rims. The diner was only a few feet away, but now there was a wall of leather and bad intentions between him and the door. Grady stepped forward, rolling his shoulders as he sized Dawson up. His vest bore the emblem of the Black Horns, a local biker gang known for pushing boundaries just enough to get a rise, but not enough to land in real trouble. "What's the rush?" Grady said, his smile thinning. "We're just being friendly, ain't we?" A couple of the bikers spread out slightly, their boots crunching against the gravel. Dawson met Grady's gaze, his expression unreadable. He didn't flinch, didn't shift. "Just grabbing some lunch," he replied, voice calm, deliberate. It wasn't the reaction they were hoping for. The lack of fear, the lack of anger, it only fueled them. Jace cracked his knuckles. "You're not gonna roll right through us, are you?" He mimicked a wheeling motion with his hands, grinning like he'd said something clever. Dawson didn't bite. He adjusted slightly, ready to maneuver past them, but before he could, Grady stepped directly into his path. "Not so fast," Grady murmured, his smirk fading into something colder. For a brief moment, the air felt different. The easygoing chatter from inside the diner seemed to dim. A few customers glanced out the window, their expressions shifting. No one moved. Dawson exhaled slowly. This was a game he had no intention of playing. But that didn't mean he hadn't already won. Dawson's eyes flicked from Grady to the rest of the group, noting how they had subtly positioned themselves in a loose semicircle. A tactic, a show of control, but fear that wasn't on the table. "I don't want any trouble," Dawson said, his voice calm but edged with something solid, something that made even men like Grady hesitate for half a second. Not that they were ready to back off. Dawson reached into his pocket, slowly, deliberately. The movement was subtle, but it didn't go unnoticed. Grady's smirk twitched, just for a moment. That caught Dawson's interest. "Who you calling, huh?" Grady barked, shifting his weight forward. "Cops ain't gonna do much out here." Dawson didn't respond. He just pressed a single button, brought the phone to his ear, and spoke quietly just a few words before ending the call. Click. No explanations, no threats, just that. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, their bravado flickering like a candle in the wind. Dawson slipped the phone back into his pocket, his expression unreadable. Grady squinted at him, trying to pick apart the silence, trying to figure out what, if anything, had just changed. "What was that about, huh?" he demanded. His tone was still cocky, but there was a sliver of something else creeping in now, uncertainty. Dawson didn't answer, because he didn't need to. Instead, he wheeled himself a few feet to the side, positioning against the diner's wall, like he had all the time in the world, relaxed, unbothered, the kind of patience that doesn't come from arrogance but from knowing something the other guy doesn't. And that was worse than any threat. "What, you got backup coming?" Jace scoffed, forcing out a laugh. But there was a tightness to it, an edge. The others laughed, too, but it wasn't real. It was just noise. The silence stretched. The bravado cracked. One of the bikers shifted, cleared his throat, murmured under his breath, "Man, I don't like this." Grady shot him a glare, but even he wasn't looking quite so sure anymore. And then it happened. A low rumble rolled through the distance. At first, it was barely there, just a whisper beneath the breeze, the faintest vibration in the air. But it grew, fast. The unmistakable roar of engines shattered the uneasy silence, swallowing every other sound in the lot. Grady's head snapped toward the road. The others followed, their confidence draining as a convoy of motorcycles came into view, gleaming chrome flashing beneath the waning Wyoming sun. They weren't just passing through, they were coming here. Dawson remained still, watching, waiting, his expression unreadable, but the faintest hint of a smirk played at the corner of his lips. The riders approached in tight formation, dozens of them, black leather, tinted visors, jackets stitched with a crest that marked them as something more than just another club. These weren't just bikers. These were brothers, and they rode like it. The convoy pulled into the parking lot with precision, parking their bikes in perfect sync, like a battle formation locking into place. The air changed. What had been a cocky little scene just moments ago now felt different, heavier. The power dynamic didn't just shift, it flipped on its head. Grady took a step back, his bravado cracking. "Who the hell are these guys?" he muttered. But deep down, he already knew. The riders dismounted in unison, the crunch of boots against gravel falling into a steady rhythm. They didn't need to posture, didn't need to shout. Their silence was the statement. And it was deafening. Then, the leader stepped forward. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a silver beard and eyes that missed nothing. His jacket bore the same insignia as the others' guardians of the road, a name that carried weight in places where weight mattered. His gaze swept the lot, assessing, calculating. Then he locked onto Dawson. "You good, brother?" he asked, his voice calm, controlled. Dawson met his eyes, nodding once. "I am now." That was all it took. The silver-bearded man turned his attention to Grady and his crew. The same crew that had been full of swagger just minutes ago now looked like they wanted to be anywhere else. Grady swallowed hard, trying to summon what was left of his bravado. "What's all this about?" he forced out, puffing up his chest. But the Guardian leader took a single step closer, just one, and Grady flinched. The silver-bearded Guardian didn't move right away. He let the moment hang, his steady gaze locking onto Grady like a steel trap. "This is about respect," he said, his voice even, carrying the kind of weight that came from a life spent meaning what he said the first time. "Something you clearly don't understand." The other Guardians shifted slightly, their stance widening just enough to make the message crystal clear. This wasn't a request. Grady's crew exchanged uneasy glances, their confidence draining with every second that passed. Jace, the wiry one with ink snaking up his arms, cleared his throat, suddenly looking a lot less cocky. "Hey man, we didn't mean anything by it," he muttered. "Just messing around, you know." But the Guardian leader didn't buy it, didn't even blink. He folded his arms, his expression carved from stone. Messing around. His voice didn't rise, but it didn't have to. Harassing a man in a wheelchair isn't messing around, it's cowardice. That hit hard. Grady shifted uncomfortably, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. For the first time, no one in his crew had a snappy comeback. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by the faint creak of the diner door as a few curious patrons peeked out, watching the scene unfold. Grady swallowed hard, his earlier smirk now nothing more than a ghost. He glanced at his crew, looking for backup, but there was none, not this time. The Guardians didn't move, they didn't need to. Their sheer presence was enough, and then Dawson finally spoke. "You thought I was alone, didn't you?" His voice was calm, matter of fact, but it cut through the tension like a blade. He let the words settle, let them sink in deep before he continued. "That's the thing about people like you. You only pick on those you think can't fight back." The silver-bearded Guardian cast Dawson a brief glance, and for the first time, the hint of a smile flickered in his sharp eyes. Then he turned back to Grady, his stance unwavering. "Now, here's what's going to happen." His voice was smooth, controlled, dangerous in its restraint. "You're going to apologize to this man properly. Then you're going to leave, and you're not going to pull this kind of stunt again, ever. Do I make myself clear?" Grady's mouth opened, probably to argue, to salvage whatever scrap of pride he had left. But the look in the Guardian leader's eyes stopped him cold. The fight drained out of him. Yeah, okay. "We're sorry," his voice was muttered, forced. Dawson raised an eyebrow. "That didn't sound like you meant it." A low murmur rippled through the Guardians, their patience running thin. The silver-bearded man leaned in, lowering his voice just enough to make Grady stiffen. "You'd better mean it." This time, the apology came louder. "We're sorry," Grady said, forcing the words out, eyes darting between Dawson and the ground. The others mumbled their own half-hearted apologies, their bravado completely gone. Dawson let the silence stretch for a beat. Then, finally, he nodded. "Apology accepted," he said, his voice steady. "But remember," he leveled them with a look, "you don't get a second chance to fix this kind of mistake." The message landed. Grady and his crew wasted no time scrambling back to their motorcycles. Engines fired up, tires spun against the gravel, and within seconds, they were gone, fleeing the parking lot like men who had just learned a lesson the hard way. The air shifted, the tension lifted. The quiet hum of normalcy began to return. Dawson exhaled, then turned to the silver-bearded man and extended a hand. Dawson grasped the Guardian leader's hand firmly, feeling the quiet strength in his grip. "Thank you," he said simply. The silver-bearded man held his gaze. "Anytime, brother, you're not alone. Remember that." And Dawson did. The Guardians began to mount their bikes, the low rumble of their engines rolling through the lot once more. But this time, the sound carried no threat, no weight of looming trouble. This time, it was a statement, solidarity. A reminder that strength isn't just about muscle or numbers, it's about standing for something that matters. As the last of the Guardians revved their engines and rolled out, Dawson let out a slow breath, feeling the tension of the past few minutes dissolve into something lighter. He could still hear the faint hum of their bikes fading into the distance, but now, instead of carrying intimidation, it carried victory. A quiet, steady triumph. Inside the diner, movement resumed. The patrons who had been watching through the windows turned back to their meals, their hushed conversations tinged with new energy. Dawson rolled toward the diner door at his own pace, no rush, no weight on his shoulders. This wasn't the first time he'd dealt with men like that, and it probably wouldn't be the last. But today had been another reminder standing firm in the face of hate wasn't just necessary. It was the right thing to do. The door swung open, and he was greeted by the warm aroma of fresh coffee and grilled burgers. Behind the counter, a waitress mid-50s, short blonde hair, sharp eyes softened by kindness, watched him with a knowing smile. "Everything okay out there?" she asked, her gaze scanning him, looking for any sign of trouble. Dawson met her eyes, his own carrying something steady. "Yeah," he said, voice warm, "everything's fine now. Just a little misunderstanding." She arched an eyebrow but didn't push. "Good to hear, your usual, please." And just like that, the world settled back into place. Because some battles don't need fists or fury. Just the right people showing up at the right time, and today they had. As Dawson settled into his usual booth, the scent of fresh coffee and fried food wrapping around him like a familiar embrace, he let himself reflect on the encounter outside. The bikers had thought they could intimidate him. They had mistaken his wheelchair for weakness. But what they hadn't counted on was this: Dawson wasn't just a man in a chair. He was part of something bigger, a community, a brotherhood. The silver-bearded guardian had been right. It wasn't just about forcing an apology, it was about the message. About making it clear that no one stands alone, and that strength isn't measured in fists, but in unity. It wasn't just the bikers who had learned something today. The people inside that diner, those who had watched from behind the safety of their booths, unsure whether to intervene, had seen it, too. Strength isn't about how much you can take. It's about who you choose to be when the pressure is on. It's about what you stand for when the moment calls for it. No one, regardless of their circumstances, should ever be underestimated. And in the end, kindness and respect will always outweigh fear and cruelty. The waitress returned, setting his coffee down with a small, knowing smile. "Here you go, hon." Dawson wrapped his hands around the warm ceramic mug, letting its heat settle into his palms. He took a sip, the rich, familiar taste grounding him, and for the first time that day, he felt at peace. He had won, not because he had fought, but because he had stayed true to himself. And sometimes that was the most powerful victory of all.